All right, let's get started then. Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us at today's FIT Authors Talks. FIT Authors Talks is part of the Love Your Library event series, and it is an initiative of the FIT Library that brings authors from our community to speak about their work. From photography to fashion illustration, fiction writing to art, these talks encompass a multitude of projects and themes and celebrate creativity. Today, our FIT authors are FIT Adjunct Assistant Professor Daniel James Cole and NYU Assistant Professor Nancy Deihl. They will discuss their book, The History of Modern Fashion. This book explores fashion not simply from an aesthetic point of view, but also as a manifestation of social and cultural change. It looks at the dissemination of style and the mechanisms of change, at the relationship between fashion and the visual, applied, and performing arts, the intertwined relationship between fashion and popular culture, the impact of new materials and technology, and the growing globalization of style. Thank you both for joining us today. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mia.
Thanks, Mio.
Thanks for that introduction. And yes, I'm here with my colleague and co-author Nancy Deihl. We're going to be talking about the history of modern fashion, which is this book. If you're not familiar with it and you're at FIT, you can certainly go to the circulation desk and look at a reserve copy to get an idea of it. Um, and We would like to thank our team at Lawrence King. First of all, our development editor, Ann Townley, who was remarkable. Our designer, Greta Rose Innes, who brought the book to life in a way that was like totally what we wanted, but at the same time surpassing our expectations. Heather Vickers, our picture editor, who uh, took her time to get to know us well, and we had a remarkably great collaboration together. And then Lee Ripley, the commissioning editor, who got us hooked into this project. Nancy, do you want to add anything about these great people?
I do. I mean, I think it was an extraordinary team, and I also want to thank Lawrence King, who was, as the publisher of a great many beautiful books. We are happy that our book is among his press's output. But I also would like to say that even though I'm teaching at NYU at the moment, Daniel and I met at FIT and started working on this when we were both teaching there. So I think the FIT connection is something that we really want to emphasize as well.
Absolutely. And one really fundamental part of that FIT connection was the work that we did at special collections and college archives, um, both as a resource for general research that went into the text of our book, but also as a source for illustrative material, of which the special collections was vastly the largest source that we had in the book. And when Nancy and I began working on this book, a lot of digital archives that are available now that we take for granted now were not available to us because we started writing this in the beginning of 2009. And so there were so many things that we were able to access because of special collections that we wouldn't have been able to access in another way. Nancy?
Yeah, and we even now think about we kind of had standing appointments at
Yes.
special collections and a cart. Each one of us had a cart and what we kind of jokingly called our permanent record. So, a record of our requests, what we wanted to see, what we actually did see, piles and piles of source material with like board bookmarks in it. I can't remember that, like the cardstock
Mhm.
archival cardstock bookmarks in it. So it was like a very cherished part of our process was researching at special collections.
I remember coming in and Clara would say things to me like, I can't fit any more the Queen onto your cart, Daniel. You got to go through some more of it. And it'd be like, okay, so yes, lots of cards and lots of that card stock. So our huge, sincere thanks to Karen and, of course, the rest of the staff,
Mhm.
April, Clara, Juliet, Nancy helped me.
Yeah, I mean, I think, right. There were also kind of student interns that came and
Yes.
went, and I think we managed to capture all the names in our book. But if you're listening and if you helped us, thank you so much.
It's amazing. This book could not have happened without the Gladys Marcus Library and Special Collections. I can completely say that. And we could even go so far as to say the Gladys Marcus Library was like the third FIT author involved in this book. Wouldn't you agree, Nancy?
Yeah, I mean, it's no exaggeration. So we I know it's Love Your Library Week, and I have to say we
Oh,
love
I
your
can do that.
library. So so thanks for everything.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, and then here is the inside of the final book. I just want you to get a glimpse at it. It's gives you an idea of Greta's fantastic layout and the frontispiece photograph there is by my friend Surachai Sayang, and I think Nancy and we pulled out pretty much every personal favor we could get. If it was, getting my friend who shoots for L'Officiel Thailand, or calling up the Avedon Foundation and reminding them we've had interns there. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this book has many hundreds of illustrations. And for people who have yet to tackle an illustrated book, we can tell you that that is a big part of it, not just choosing them, but finding, the budget for them. So any illustration we could get for low cost or for free was we tried to make a place for.
And as we go along with our presentation today, talking about this book from other angles, we'll probably be telling illustration stories along the way because they were so much a part of our experience in along with the writing of this. And just to take a look inside, I want you to notice that some of the design, these are 3 look inside pages I just pulled off of Amazon yesterday, but they're great. And I think they give you a good idea of not only Greta's fabulous work as the art director of the book, but a convention that we got going from every chapter throughout the book, where we start with a full page image that was never a fashion photograph. It was always fine art with clothing in it or fashion illustration. And then opposite, we have the beginning of the chapter and a small illustration that's intended to bounce off of the big one. So here we have a La Pop Vogue cover with a Georges Barbier illustration from a French magazine. This is the 1980s, where we have a Nagel poster opposite a Fornasetti textile. And then here we have a 2000s image where we've got Westcott's painting Isaac that I saw in an exhibition at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Fell in love with it, and the painter had passed away, but her widower arranged for us to get the piece. And then we've got him in the street look opposite Project Runway. So our first topic, I'm going to turn over to Nancy to talk about one of our approaches to clothing in the book.
Right. So one of the things that we were really keen on was producing a book that was authoritative, but also very attractive, and always uppermost in our minds was to place fashion in a context. So that carried through in the images that we chose, but also in each chapter, we included information about um, social and economic information, politics, the arts, literature, and basically kind of social activities. So that was really important. And it was also important for us to kind of find images to support that quest, as you can see from the ones that we're kind of running through here.
And stressing a variety of different shots. There's some fashion industry imagery here, but a lot of outside imagery. And we really did try to go for, a fair amount of the outside imagery. Um, and leading us to our next topic, we really strove for a variety of illustrative material, getting a number of different ways. We refused from the get-go to have any secondary research
Mhm.
in the book. We're not going to have it at all. And we're glad that once we made our argument in that favor, the publishers completely supported us in that decision. So here we got another illustration from the book. In the 1900s. This is a Picasso painting, and it is from circa 1902, 1903. And I just happened to be in Cleveland um, on kind of a lark, and I saw this at the museum and sort of, was gobsmacked by it. And we had to work hard to convince everyone that it was worth the fee because the Picasso estate had renewed the copyright after the images had lapsed into public domain. So it was a challenge, but we
Mhm.
did get it. Now this one I saw a few years later at Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and at Kirchner, and it seems kind of similar, but it's a very different type of person. One reason why we really enjoyed this was not only was it very evocative of the 1910s, but the women pictured in it are seamstresses. They worked in the fashion industry. Now, one that I think Nancy and I just really enjoyed delving into was looking at how sheet music became a source of fashion information. And here are two that we used in the book. Frequently in class, I look at more. Now, sheet music is kind of a dying art form, but it was really important to the late 19th century and the 20th century, um, just as a pop culture phenomenon, but also for what kind of images are depicted. And we also looked at posters for film and or used all of these things, posters for film and for opera productions and stage productions. And these are two that we utilized in the book that we were both quite taken with. On the left is for the opera Louise by Charpentier, being presented in Paris. And it's not there so much to represent exact fashions, but to be emblematic of an Art Nouveau feeling of the 1900s decade. Um, on the right, we see a poster for Entozaki Shange's a play for colored girls who have considered suicide. And it's not only emblematic of illustration style of the 1970s, but we also can see depicted things like the headscarf and the earrings, which are very specific fashion information. One of my favorite pairings in the book is this in the 1950s, where we have these two images placed side by side, and how, in a way, they're so oddly similar because they're both pop culture, they're both red and have turquoise in them, but notice the very contradictory stereotypes of what women in the 1950s are. And I actually like showing this pairing in class and getting the students' reactions from it. Um, I also delved into my own personal photo album. This is my great grandparents getting married in Portland, Oregon in 1901. And the dress she's wearing, very typical of the lingerie dress styles of the time. And here, not groundbreaking that we'd use this, of course, but a film still, again, taking ourselves into the world that isn't just fashion photography or fashion illustration. Nancy, turning it over to you.
Sure. So we also included in every chapter two, three, sometimes I think as many as four, what we call sidebars. And these were this device enabled us to tell some stories that existed kind of outside of the text, really to enhance particular stories. So, for example, we gave Frances Folsom Cleveland, an American first lady, a nice sidebar and showed how she was an early example of kind of um, like an what's the word, an unintentional endorser of products, as in this little tray that she definitely didn't pose for, but they felt free to use her image on for kidney and liver treatment. And then in the 1940s, something completely different, we did a little homage to the pinup girl and the illustrator Vargas and his contributions to this lasting image of like the 1940s, especially like wartime woman. We wanted to tell we wanted to tell a story about paper fashions of the 1960s. Obviously, it's a phenomenon that's pretty famous, but we were so lucky to find a menswear example. And as this shirt from the Philadelphia Museum proclaims, the wearer likes girls and, in particular, appreciated Brigitte Bardot, Raquel Welch, and Ursula Andress, among
And
others.
several others on that shirt. Yeah. And this one of the sidebars for the last chapter of the book, which covers 2000 to 2010 in this edition. And we came to near the very end of the book. This is the last sidebar of the book. And the sidebar explored the phenomenon of homelessness as inspiration for fashion and kind of of landed on the story of this Chinese homeless man who emerged as an internet celebrity and fashion icon in 2010. Um, and its timing of his fame coincided with a Vivienne Westwood menswear collection inspired by this. Now, Nancy and I were not we're not looking at this in praise of homelessness as an inspiration of fashion, but we were actually putting it to question, putting the ethics of this phenomenon to question. And I think it wasn't until the last chapter that we kind of allowed ourselves to be a little bit, um, for a
Critical
little bit opinionated. Help me out, Nancy.
critical. I think, as the book kind of rolls along, some things we were happy to highlight just as historical incidents, but this we felt deserved a little bit more commentary.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, this sidebar I expanded into a several thousand word journal article, and it was published in Critical Studies in Men's Fashion in 2018. And my friend Andy Riley was the editor on it. So this kind of took an arc and got presented at a CSA symposium. So another thing that we wanted to do in the book, I think from the very beginning, Nancy and I sought this out, was to highlight some lesser known designers. And one thing that I think is really great is some of these lesser known designers have become a little bit better known in the 10 years or so since we did the research, or at least are beginning to be a little bit better known in history. And one of the first was John Redfern, who I've been a big champion of, and his house, and was nearly ignored by a lot of other fashion history survey books and 20th century fashion books. And not only his house in England, but the subsequent international business and the couture house in Paris that carried on for many years. So it was a story that needed to be re-included. And I'm so happy that there is more attention on Redfern now. This is by Maison Félix. This, unfortunately, was not an illustration in the book, no matter how gorgeous this dress is, but Félix is a designer who was huge at the time in the late 19th century. And I believe his career has been overshadowed, not in his own time, but in history, um, because of all of the attention that's put on worth. And Félix is attributed to being the designer of the black dress in John Singer Sargent's Madame X painting. Um, just skipping ahead to the 1980s, this is Katie Pye, an Australian designer who was very popular for a period of time in the 70s or 80s. Penelope Tree wore some of her clothes, and really important to a postmodern aesthetic. This is Sandra Garrett, who we gave space and an illustration in History of Modern Fashion. And I ended up revisiting her in a book we'll mention at the end of our presentation. And then Lee Sang Bong, who is one of my favorite designers alive today, who I'm not going to say he's a lesser known designer, but for many years he got a real lesser known role to play in the fashion industry outside of Korea. And now he is picking up steam in his worldwide view. But when we wrote it, I was still, confronted with people who would say, "Who?" And he's such an amazing designer. I don't think he deserves to be in that status. So, Nancy.
Yeah, so another one of the themes that we really tried to, explore throughout the book was this idea that there are global influences on fashion. Sometimes the fashionable world expands, and sometimes influences come into areas via trade and travel, etc. So one of the first examples we were able to include were these prints by Yoshu Chikanobu that showed ballroom dancing. Daniel, can you advance that one?
Oh, sorry.
Ballroom dancing in the late 19th century, in the 1880s, at the level of the court in Japan, as they were first kind of experimenting with Western dress in conjunction with musical explorations. And then we also show, so that's kind of Japan looking at Western dress. And then we have like European Parisian couture looking at Asian influences, as in this opera cloak by the House of Paquin from 1912. And we're very happy to be able to show an actual extant example from a museum collection and the way it was illustrated in one of the luxury publications of the time. And another one of our favorite illustrations is this collage by Ernst Dryden from the 1920s, showing these very avant-garde characters in their lounging pajamas in kind of a 1920s idea of Chinese influence or chinoiserie. And Daniel can tell you the story of the acquisition of this particular
Yeah, this
image.
illustration was one of the funniest moments in our illustration process with our great picture editor. We found this image in a great book on illustrator and designer Ernst Dryden, and we fell in love with it. The picture editor researched the picture, and it turned out to be in the collection of Stephen Sondheim. And she contacted Stephen Sondheim, and he very graciously got back to her and gave us the permission to reproduce the picture. But what got sent to us, I think by his assistant, was a digital photograph of the illustration hanging on the wall in his living room. And we were like, oh crap, because at that point, we'd gotten the permission, but we just didn't know what to do. So the image in the book was large. And so we just went to the original book and scanned the image, much to the horrors of our editor. And it runs pretty small in the finished book, not like it's a whole page. So the scan that we did was completely fine. But it was just yet another goofy set of like kind of madcap things that we had to go through in the process of getting these images. And another back to the east-west connection, here are three sidebars that we used in the 1930s chapter. It was these three women who were style setters involved with promoting Asian looks in Western clothing in the 1930s. And this, of course, is Anna May Wong, who promoted the actual cheongsam that we see on the left, and then also promoted these cheongsam-inspired dresses like this Travis Banton that is now in the Brooklyn Museum collection at the Met Costume Institute. And then the next woman on our list is, for the 30s, is the opera singer from France, Lily Pons, whose role in the opera Lakme encouraged these costumes influencing sari inspiration in high fashion, such as V&A and Schiaparelli and Valentina, and also bare midriff looks. And then the last of our 30 sidebars was Dorothy Lamour, who played the Malayu jungle princess, not actually being Malay herself, but whose costumes brought influence from the Malay archipelago into Western fashion.
And throughout the book, although there's obviously most of it is about women's wear, we talk about children and menswear in every chapter. And one of our favorite images that we found really focused on Indian influence in 1960s fashion. And so we were able to include this cover from a Simplicity pattern showing how the home sewer could make her own version of Nehru jackets for a little boy. And toward the end of the book, in the early 2000s, we have the adorable Korean boy band Big Bang here in an ad for a cell phone company in their colorful outfits, but also showing how cell phones themselves became a really important accessory in fashion during the early 21st century.
And then, as we mentioned with, a little earlier, some of these other collections we were talking about. Nancy, you can continue with this.
Sure. So we also tried to highlight work from lesser known museum collections, such as this amazing Worth wedding bodice that we got from Case Western, from the Western Reserve Society. And we did, I think we did a full page image
Mhm.
of it because it is so amazing and we felt it really deserved to be highlighted.
And in a time period when the growth of couture was so important, we really wanted to show a detail of what real couture technique was.
And also emphasizing Worth's American clientele too. And the next image is a detail from a paisley shawl that we got from the Spurlock Museum at the University of Illinois. Again, these places might not be the first thing you think of for fashion imagery, but there are all these wonderful hidden collections that deserve more attention.
Like this, actually, I saw this painting right at the very beginning of our process of writing the book. I was in Melbourne, Australia. This was hanging in the National Gallery of Victoria, and I came to find out that the Melbourne area had a pre-Raphaelite circle that was sort of the gentry there. And so we added to our illustrations for the pre-Raphaelite and aesthetic dress in the first chapter and included this in that one.
And we also were lucky enough to get a real Hawaiian shirt from the apparel collection that is owned by the fashion design department at the University of Hawaii. So we have a really wonderful, colorful Hawaiian shirt.
So Nancy.
And so we kind of one of the things we really thought about was, wrapping up the book and talking about just why this topic is so important. So we really thought about the immense influence that fashion has on contemporary life, and we looked at fashion's presence in the media, especially in film and television. So obviously, these are the ladies from Absolutely Fabulous, and then we talked about the enormous success of Project Runway in all its international versions.
Great. So here we are, the launching of the book. This is actually in um, 2016, and we're doing a book signing at Opera America up the street. I just kind of want to share with you some of our experiences, which have been very delightful. Here we are signing books, and actually all three of the young women in that picture were students or former students, which was really enriching. Nancy, you want to?
Yeah, I'd look at that. I can see
No,
them. Right.
it's great. I was just talking to Stephanie the other day. And here we are, about a year into sales. This is on the shelf at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I started something on my social media where I asked friends to send me pictures from wherever they were. And so here we've got the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. We have the McCord Museum of Canadian History in Montreal over there. This is the S-Light bookstore in Taipei City, Taiwan. And then this is me in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where I found a copy of my book on the table there. So, and just I want to remind everybody, not only was it the library at FIT that helped us out so much, but we also had a lot of help through people we knew in our departments, like uh, professor from the Department of Illustration who got us hooked up with a illustrator we couldn't find because of her connections in the guild. This is my colleague Rinaldo Barnetti in fashion design department who did that amazing illustration that we've got there that we gave a full page. We also use an illustration by Professor Steven Stippelman as the full page illustration for the beginning of the 1970s chapter. Here's my best friend. We took the book around Queens, got pictures. This is in the Queens Center Mall. I think he's waiting for us to autograph it, but yeah, it got a little goofy. And then this one got sent to me from Seattle, Washington, not actually in the store, but this is my cat niece, Katya. I think she was interested in animal prints. So, um, and one thing to be serious about. Again, here we have the Italian edition. This is the first foreign language it's been translated into, and this came out about 5 years ago, I think. There have been interest in some other foreign language editions, um, but a lot of things, with COVID, are still in the works, still up in the air. Oops, I've gone back to Katya. And then I wanted to briefly mention this book. I'm going to give it back to Nancy, but in one of the very first authors' talks you had, you presented Lourdes, who spoke about her chapter in this book that Nancy edited. And I contributed a chapter in this book about the 80s modular designer Sandra Garrett that I mentioned earlier. Nancy, do you want to?
Yeah, so this is a wonderful extension of our collaboration. So Daniel contributed a chapter, Lourdes Font contributed a chapter, April Callahan from Special Collections did an amazing chapter based again on Special Collections material where they have the Tina Lisa papers. So this is another, just I think another adventure in expanding the canon and bringing attention to some lesser known names, in this case, in particular, in the American fashion industry.
And there's also a chapter by Jan Glyer Reeder, who was FIT trained, and
Yep.
by Natalie Nudell, who came here to teach after finishing her degree at NYU.
And also Jennifer, who did the chapter on children's wear. I mean, I'd have to
Yes,
look at the index
I know.
to be
Yeah.
really thorough about all the FIT connections on this one.
Yeah. Anyway, so more of that. So I think we are ready for Q&A.
Mhm.
Um,
All right, thank you guys. And I just want to commend you again for the creation of such a beautiful book. I have it here
Thank you.
so people have an idea of scale. The illustrations are really fantastic. So much so that I have to remind myself to also read the text to learn because you do get dragged along by all the beautiful illustrations and the photographs. So I have a comment and a question to start us off with. I wanted to mention that one of my favorite sections was the part about tattoos, actually, where you talk about how I think it was what the early 19th, late early 20th
Yeah.
century. There was kind of a trend for a lot of royalty to get tattoos, such as Tsar Nicholas II, and I think George V was one of the
hmm
ones. I really enjoyed that section. That was very surprising. So my question is, when I opened the book for the first time, I was surprised. I just assumed you would start a book on modern fashion in 1900. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why you started at 1850. What was the reasoning behind that?
Um, I
Nancy, go ahead.
think that there's a couple of reasons. Number one is that that's really when the quote like designer system starts. And if we really think about like what is the model of modern fashion, it has to do a lot with this kind of named creator and also the contrast between like named creator fashion and industrialized fashion. And because of that, although, things are always open to question, a lot of schools base their curricula around that paradigm. And so we opted to follow that chronology, but hoped to add to it along the way. Is that fair to
And
say,
also,
Daniel?
yeah, definitely. I think there's so much happening in dressmaking and designer system at that time. And it's during the 1860s that you get the first blossom of not only Worth, but Pinga and Redfern. And then also there's so many inventions that happen at that point that have a modern feel to them, like aniline dye. That's a um, very much anticipates the synthetic processes that are going to be in clothing as we get into the 1900s. And also the fact that crinolines, which I can't imagine people thinking of a crinoline as modern, but the crinolines became being made of sprung steel. And I mean, that's trippy too. I think we mentioned this in the sidebar in the crinoline about how women walking down the street, if they had a sprung steel crinoline, it would make like a boing, boing, boing noise, which just seems so futuristic and otherworldly, and not at all what you would expect the crinoline to be about.
That's so interesting to think about, the sounds that fashion might make.
Yeah.
Um, all right, so we do have some questions coming in. We do have a comment, first of all. Leslie mentioned that we do have an ebook version of this available through the library if people are interested in that. So the first question, is there a new edition coming of this book?
A new edition has been discussed, and then it's still up in the air. I corresponded with our editor about 6 weeks ago. Um, However, two things happened. COVID happened, and then the Lawrence King was sold to Hachette. And because COVID happened shortly after the sale of Lawrence King, um, we're still waiting for the dust to settle on that issue. So we we're ready to go. We actually started work on it before these things occurred. So, we'll hopefully these things will get worked out in the next couple of years and another edition can be forthcoming. We've certainly learned a lot from the first one. There might be some tweaks that Nancy and I want to make in addition to writing a new chapter. So, Nancy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we're definitely open to, and we'd like to make it happen. So, but obviously, there's a lot of things that have to be put into place.
Great, that's great to hear that that's still a possibility, still an open
Yeah.
door.
Yes.
Next question, what was the most difficult element regarding your researching in primary sources?
Hmm.
I don't know because we love it.
Yeah.
We love to research in primary sources. I would say maybe too much. Actually, like the kind of deciding what's important. I,
Yeah. I remember Nancy became especially vexed with me because when we were writing the 1910s chapter, I read every issue of The Queen and every issue of Les Modes during that decade. Now, I think the chapter's great, but maybe that was doing a little bit much. The
Mhm.
other problem I felt was we couldn't go to Paris to go research at the archives there. Didn't you feel that, Nancy?
Yeah, and one of the things that we tried to make up for this. So, we would see a designer's name over and over again in like primary sources of the period and not be able to find out more about them.
Hmm.
So we like the kind of remedy, the approach we took was to include those names in our book as just kind of, other designers who were also working were, so that at least future researchers could kind of like pick up where we left off. So I would say that was one thing, because there's gaps, there's gaps in periodicals, in archival material, etc. So that was one thing, we got fascinated with people that we couldn't like track down.
Yeah, that and Felix's story was part of that, and there were a few other designers, Maggie Roof. There was a lot of murky information, and again, um, I think that there's places where we simply didn't have access to the digital archives that are available now. And the big one was Gallica, I think,
Mhm.
got launched right at the time we were going to press. So Gallica wasn't a source. So, hey, we can look at it now, and that's great. So, and speaking of Felix, I found out some great stuff about Felix on Gallica after we had gotten printed. So, that happens.
Yeah, well, if the new edition does kind of start rolling, maybe that will be an excuse to go to Paris to do more follow-up research.
Exactly.
That would
Great
be
idea.
nice. All right, so one other comment. We also do have your article that you mentioned, Daniel, about the homeless fashion,
Oh, wow. Okay.
in our collection as well, if people are looking to track that down. I believe that's Dumpster Chic and Haute Homeless
Yes, it is
is the
indeed.
title.
That's
Okay.
great that you've
Yeah,
got
you
that.
can
Yeah.
find that in our catalog if anyone's looking for that.
Okay.
All right, next question is one that I was also wondering. So this is a co-authored book. How did you two divide the work? Did you co-write chapters? Did you divvy up which chapter went to which person?
No, we actually had such a nice time with how we wrote the proposal, which was a constant back and forth, that originally the commissioning editor said something like, "Have you thought about dividing up the chapters?" And her initial response was just no. And uh, we broke down things so that, like, through a lot of the book, I would write women's wear. We'd divide the designers in half. Nancy would write men's wear and children's wear, but then we would sit down together with our work and go through like every single sentence so that it had this congealed voice. And actually, the editor remarked how she was so surprised that a multi-author book had such a unified tone to it. And I think that's why. Nancy, what do you want to contribute to that?
Yeah, I mean, even though people might see a chapter as a chapter, we always thought of it as a kind of an amalgam of different stories. And so we literally had a working document for every, like an outline of every chapter. And we would say, like, okay, I'll do books. You'll do, Daniel will do kind of royal assassinations.
Yeah, well, I was an expert at royal assassinations. Yeah,
And then I'll do like architecture, and he'll do accessories, this kind of thing. And we worked a lot on our own, and then we would come together on Sunday afternoons, and we would kind of put things. We really worked like every Sunday afternoon practically for like I don't know, 7 years, and we
seven
would
years.
put it
Yeah.
together. We literally like put our documents together, and we read it out loud. So that's how it was really like forging something, like crafting it.
Mhm. I remember Nancy's husband teasing us about how much energy we would put into a choice of one word, but we did. So, yeah.
So I guess this is part two of this question. Feels more like a
Mhm.
trivia question. How many words are there in total? I know this book is about 600 illustrations on 400 pages.
It's about 200,000,
Hmm.
Wow.
and the total page count, I think, is 480.
Hmm.
Originally, they wanted a 100,000 word book, and we came to them with the first chapter, and they were a little overwhelmed by how it was maybe twice the length they wanted, and were very worried. And then the editor kind of stuck to her guns and was like, let them write the book they're going to write. And
Hmm.
Nancy?
Yeah, and they also, included in that original 100,000 word count, they wanted a glossary and the captions for the illustrations, which, you'd be surprised you have to allow for. So, but I think what we were delivering changed the scope of the project in a good direction.
Yeah, I think they were sort of envisioning something more coffee table at the onset of the project. And as we started delivering something more scholarly, our editor advocated them to change their vision of what was going to be the end result.
Okay, interesting to hear about the many transitions the book went through as you
Well,
guys
we had an awesome
started writing it.
editor. an awesome editor who unfortunately has passed away since this project, and we miss her. But was a great publishing house to work with, and the other team members that we have been paired up with, as I mentioned earlier, were all fantastic.
All right, so next question. What knowledge regarding the history of fashion did you gain that you did not realize until after you completed the book? Any insights?
Like
Things that aren't,
everything.
Nancy, you go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, I think, since I did a lot of the research on menswear, I really learned a lot about menswear through the really interesting sources that I had not used that much before. So that was fantastic for me. Also, it was really interesting to start to think more thoroughly, more deeply about the connections between like the other arts and fashion. Not to say that I didn't know it before, but I felt like this was an opportunity to really like dig into that. So things about like fashion and technology and, fashion and the stage, which I was not my strong suit before this.
And I think that one thing I got, and I actually got this early on in our process, was questioning the accepted narrative that's been repeated a lot, like, Worth invented haute couture, or Poiret revolutionized fashion with his 1907 collection, or the new look was new. All of those things that we actually might have been taught and we see repeated over and over in, like, social media or wherever. And when you start looking at the primary sources, it's like, but that's not true, And so I think that the act of writing this book has completely um, taught me not to accept these repeated stories over and over again.
Yeah, there's a lot of mythologies that have built up around fashion and
Absolutely.
characters in fashion.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Follow-up question to that, did writing this book inform other aspects of your professional life, like your teaching, for example?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, it's been great because I think that, it developed a level of like a depth of knowledge that I didn't have before this. And also, it really made me appreciate the idea of transitions. And that's something that I so emphasize. I'm sure my students get tired of hearing, there's never a light switch at the end of the decade, but I think it's so important that people recognize transitions and evolution in fashion. And that comes directly out of the research that we did for this book. And that's also why in every chapter we put an end of the decade part to kind of guide the reader into the next decade, but it's dependent on what has already happened. So it's about transitions.
Hmm. Definitely. Um, I think that in teaching, I'm much more inclined to emphasize the myth busting, to try to encourage them not to just Google Chanel and come up with erroneous information that says Chanel invented the black dress and she invented modern clothing and all of these things, but how to look at these careers without buying into the nonsense of these ground zero moments, and of understanding that everything in fashion is something that builds on what's there before, right? And it's this cycle. And the idea of aha moments happening, like we see promoted in so much fashion writing, that needs to be questioned continually.
Yeah, and I think that's a good takeaway for any students also. Like, you have to learn about what came before, but also maybe question that narrative or unpack
Mm.
that a little bit as you get deeper into it. Next question. In a new edition, would you add more designers from diverse cultural communities?
As we encounter them, absolutely. Now, the new edition, we would write about the 2010s. So just by writing about the 2010s, you're going to get more diversity. I think we did pretty well in the course of the book. Nancy, take this over.
Yeah, I mean, we really tried to include people from diverse cultures and communities at every opportunity. I mean, I think ours is the first kind of general fashion history, for example, that includes Madam C.J. Walker, the
Mhm.
beauty entrepreneur. That's one of the reasons why we do want to do an update, is to have that opportunity to dig in further.
And we included Keckley, the designer for Mary Todd Lincoln, with a chunk in the first chapter. Um, and like for instance, when we did the um 1920 sidebar on the popularity of seductive leading men, we discussed, along with all of the, mainstream white guys, we discussed the career of Sesue Hayakawa and how important he was to being a pop culture icon, but also a Japanese American at that time. And I think that we definitely want to continue with that direction as we go further to writing another edition, because, we have the momentum to continue contributing to that conversation. And that's very important.
Yeah, I do think those end up being sometimes the most interesting parts.
Hmm.
I think that's it for questions so far. Feel free to chat if anyone else has any lingering questions. Um, Anything coming up next for you guys? Anything that you're working on either individually or together that we could look forward to?
I don't have any projects going at the moment. I have something in my mind, but trying to navigate, like, teaching in COVID has taken a lot of energy. And so once we get through that, fingers crossed, we can start to think about branching out.
And I'm currently designing costumes for a production of La Boheme in Milwaukee. And it actually, speaking of our conversation, it's being set in 1950 and it has an all black principal cast. And I was looking at the work of Zelda Wynn Valdez for one of my leading ladies who needs a strapless evening gown. So I'm working on that. And I'm also working on an edited volume on fashion history mythology
Great.
with multiple authors.
Very cool. Right, that takes us to just about 6 o'clock. So
Okay.
if there are no further questions, I don't see any coming in. I'd like to thank you, Daniel and Nancy, for your great discussion of the history of modern art. So for more information on FIT authors or how to submit to be featured, if you're interested, go to the website at authors.fitnyc.edu. You can also follow us on Instagram at FIT Library for info on any upcoming FIT authors talks. And I think we have one coming up in April, actually. We definitely have more coming up this semester, so please keep a lookout. All
Great.
right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Good night.
Thank you.